Okay, it looks like we've got a pretty good quorum, so let's get started. My name is Steve McKinney with Lenovo's Data Center Group Executive Briefing Center, and I want to thank you for joining us today for another virtual briefing as part of our Business Continuity Series, where we'll be focusing on automation for uptime. Now, this series is brought to you by Lenovo's Data Center Group Executive Briefing Center, and we are located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. If you'd like more information on us, or possible future opportunities to work with us, you'll see a link at the top there where you can find more out about the Briefing Center. This session will be recorded, and it'll be available so that, if you want to revisit it or share it with some colleagues, it'll be available to do so. If you'd like more details on today's topics, or discussions on even totally different topics, and you want to reach out to the Briefing Center, please use the email at the bottom of this chart. Now, for you to get the most out of this session, there's a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to cover. First, we will be providing a handout, or handouts. They will include today's presentation, one of the reference to industry analyst studies or reports, and then a schedule of some of our future events. Hopefully you'll find some of those, of some value or some interest to you. But for today's particular session, while we're working together here, the most important thing is to encourage you to ask questions, as we're going along. And to do that, we have provided the GoToWebinar control panel at the right of your screen there, with a questions tab where you can enter your requests. Now, we'll be monitoring this and providing answers, as they come in. If by chance we don't get to your question before we finish and you have to sign off, we will get back to you with an answer using email. But obviously, our goal here is to provide you with all the information you need about today's topic. All right, to get started, what I'd like to do is to introduce Dave Lobsher, who is also a member of our Executive Briefing Center, and he specializes in our systems management offerings, which are really the core of what we're going to be discussing today. So, Dave, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here. Glad to have an opportunity to share with folks some of the things that we can do for automating to drive better availability.
Yeah, well, that's from the work you and I've done in the briefing centers. We know, how important this can be from a standpoint of reducing the cost of these environments, which everybody's always very conscious about. So one of the other things, though, and not knowing, how much people know about us in the audience today, there are many who think that Lenovo is just a hardware company. But actually, we can provide a very broad range of opportunities to help our customers with, their technology and business challenges, Dave. So could you do me a favor and, give us a little more insight as to what that might include?
Yeah, Steve, I'd be happy to. And I think that's a good place to kind of start things off, because as we talk about business continuity, we talk about driving better uptime, higher availability. We're going to spend some time today talking about some hardware features, but I think it's always good to kind of put things into context, because at the end of the day, no one is buying and running a server or a piece of storage just for the sake of having the lights blink on the server itself, right? Folks are doing it to build a solution, and we've got a wide range of these different solutions that we focus on from a Lenovo perspective. We call them validated solution designs, and the way that we attack this is we partner with a number of the people that you see highlighted there, because a lot of cases, clearly, we talk about VDI, for example. Let me just use that as an example of one of these areas, because it's certainly one that gets a lot of focus right now, with a lot of folks, clearly doing remote work and building an infrastructure to support that. It's not just about doing VDI all on our own. It's about partnering up with a Citrix, for example, or a VMware, to use Horizon for some infrastructures. And so we've got these validated designs that we can offer for customers that kind of take it from end to end. And when we talk about business continuity, we actually have some of these virtual briefings. We did one here a couple of days ago, focused on some services. We've got one coming up at the end of the week focused in on VDI within the context of business continuity. So I think that's an important element of it. We also, kind of at a layer below that, we have a set of offerings we label as Think Agile. And Think Agile is maybe not bundling the total solution, right? We're not going to necessarily package VDI into a Think Agile solution straight from the factory, but straight from the factory, we can have a hyper-converged infrastructure. And so it's going to have, in some cases, a VMware or a Microsoft or a Nutanix infrastructure, or with our Think Agile CP, some of our own hyper-converged or converged infrastructure, really, in that case. And the idea is that, once again, business continuity at that level also has some meaning. And we've got another session coming up just a week from today, in fact, focused in on business continuity at that level, right? So there's all different levels that we can focus in on these availability and trying to drive uptime for our environment. And another one that's kind of an interesting focus also is storage, right? Because the Think System family is really our broader family of building blocks. So Think Agile is kind of a little bit more of an appliance kind of a focus, where we're looking at kind of building some of the software-defined infrastructure into it. Think System is really getting back down into the building blocks, and we're going to spend a lot of time today focusing in on some of the availability things that we can do from a server perspective. We're going to focus in on storage once again a little bit later on in the series, in this business continuity series. We've got some other sessions coming up in a little while. So I just kind of wanted to give that overview, because again, we are going to focus a lot in on kind of some detailed hardware features today, but I didn't want kind of the bigger message to get lost in some of that detail. I think that detail is really important, and I want to make sure we got an opportunity to kind of share that, but it does kind of fit into a broader perspective. But Steve, let me turn it back to you now, because as we focus in more on the server aspect of it, we do have a lot of things that we do in those products to drive the availability of the underlying infrastructure. So maybe you've got some more things to share along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. In fact, as people look at solutions, I mean, so often, rightfully so, companies are looking at some kind of a business issue they've got to solve, that we can have technology help them, or a technology problem they're looking to solve. And they start at the higher end of what they're trying to accomplish with it. And eventually they do get down to the infrastructure. All right. But there is a reality that says, if that infrastructure is not available, if it's not working properly, I don't care how good the rest of the stack is, software or support or any of that stuff. If the infrastructure is not up and running, then nothing works. All right. So, and as we brought up here, I mean, reliability is absolutely key. And good news for us and for our customers, reliability is something that is at the heart of what Lenovo does with all of its infrastructure. This happens to be a representation here, or an actual chart from a company called ITIC. And a couple times a year, they go out and they do a survey of data centers. It's a real basic survey. I mean, it's basically one question. When they go to these data center managers, say, okay, from a reliability standpoint, we would like to know, based on platform, and you'll see some listed down there, Cisco, Dell, HP, et cetera. Based on platform, what percentage, not how many systems, because if you got more than one than another, it would skew the results. So what percentage of those systems have had at least one outage of 4 hours or longer in the last 12 months? So it's not complex. It's pretty easy to gather. And you can see over the last 4 studies, the different representations here of the companies, and they've run from 2% of their product having those issues all the way up to 16. And you see some of the big hikes in these things. Those were actually, where the technology changed. We went from, the EP and the EX architectures, the dual architecture Intel had, to Purley, a single architecture. New stuff, exciting stuff, but some challenges. So as you can see, though, where's Lenovo rated here? 1%. And this is not just, one study. For the past 7 years, I've got 4 studies listed here, but for the past 7 years, all right, we have continued to be the leader in reliability. And so as we move forward, I mean, there's a reality that this doesn't happen by accident. All right. So let's take a look at some of the things that we do in order to try to drive that reliability. All right. And there's a number of things, and they aren't just all, a specific piece of hardware. Some things we have here, example, our supply chain is unique. We own our own manufacturing, either the whole plant, people, process, everything, or all the people, process, and lease the plant or something. But we own our own manufacturing, which makes it different from the rest of the vendors that are out there. The rest of them, I mean, they collect their parts and then they send them off to Foxconn or some other place to assemble them. I mean, you really don't have much control over quality or how that gets done once that happens. And the suppliers that we get parts from, I mean, we put very strict, high quality requirements on them. But it's more than just that. We have what we call a trusted supplier program. And for an organization or company to be a supplier for the things that we need to build this infrastructure, they have got to fill out a questionnaire. It's in excess of 200 questions. And the answers have got to be those that are acceptable to us. And if they are, well, then they become one of our suppliers. We always have multiple suppliers for about everything we've got. But this isn't a one-time deal. They can't sneak something in on us and then change, because we do audit them. And if they don't keep up their end of the deal, they get removed from the supplier list until we actually double check them and find out that they can live up to that list. And a little bit more remote of an idea is we do have companies that are, say, part of being a quality provider. All right, and especially if you're looking at a worldwide marketplace, which so many folks are today, especially with the internet and everything. Are you compliant with what they call the TAA, the Trade Agreement Act, which basically says that I can source product from you, not just from one location. I've got a breadth of choices and offerings to do that, and we are compliant because we do have plants in Europe, we do have plants in Mexico, we can do assembly right here in North Carolina, not that far from where the briefing center is. So that's one aspect of it. From there, if we take a look then at some of the redundancy that's built into these things, because obviously redundancy is going to provide a level of quality from a quality of uptime. All right, and we look at all the components and see where we think that we need that redundancy. A couple of examples I've given here, and you're all familiar with technology, so you recognize a lot of them. The first one up in the right-hand corner, that is actually a new component that we put in our new ThinkSystem servers as part of making it more reliable, obviously, as well as make it perform better. It's the solid-state media, all right, that you can plug into the motherboard very close to the processor and use it to boot the hypervisor or operating system, et cetera, from. All right, really shortens up that boot time. And of course, solid state media is extremely reliable, but it's not perfect. Right? So what this image shows you here is that the actual media between those two blue pieces of plastic there, the two ends, that media is mounted onto a backplane. And by doing that, we can actually put a second one on the other side with the RAID chip on here and get redundancy. So, forbid something should happen to that component that you're using, it'll automatically fail over and give you an opportunity to set up some planned maintenance for it based on that requirement. Otherwise, a number of things, and it's represented in this shuttle for one of our dense systems, but redundant power supplies, redundant fans. You can certainly put in redundancy of PCI cards, redundancy of networking, a number of things that we include in that. One of the other things we include is what they call predictive failure analysis, PFA. And it's almost a former version of artificial intelligence. And it's my subsystem, and we are the leader in the industry today of providing predictive failure analysis in our systems. And we have it for processors, memory, power supplies, disk drives, voltage regulated modules, fans, etc. And what it's all about is that these things have been in operation for so many decades that there's enough intelligence built into them that they can self-monitor to see how they're doing. And they've got models to compare to how they're performing. And if they start to develop the appearance of a model that is heading towards failure, they can surface an alert. And then instead of waiting for it to fail, you can set up some preventive maintenance here and actually get that fixed. All right. So in fact, Dave, if I recall, you're going to demonstrate kind of how this all works at the operating system level. When these physical alerts take place, all right, at the system level, what happens at the operating level? You got something like that?
Yeah, in fact, Steve, let me jump out of the presentation here. Let me bring up my demo environment. And what I want to show is an example of that, right? What happens when you get a PFA alert and how we can automate, what I kind of call the rescuing of the workload, right? And whether that's a hard failure or whether it's a predictive failure alert, what we do with our management is we integrate this seamlessly into vCenter. And so what we're looking at here is the vCenter console. But behind the scenes, we also have our xClarity Administrator up and running. And so xClarity Administrator is doing the monitoring of the systems. And when it sees something like a predictive failure alert, it's going to seamlessly integrate that into vCenter so that vCenter gets that same alert. And so in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate one of those alerts. Let me select one of these servers that I have in my vSAN cluster. So you can see here I've got a vSAN cluster. This is using our VX, Think Agile VX models that actually we'll discuss on our next virtual briefing as we talk about some of the infrastructure platforms for high availability. But anyway, I've got a number of nodes in this cluster. And when I select this top one here, you can see that right now I've got 4 different workloads running on that particular system. And so what I want to do is I want to simulate what would happen in the case of a predictive failure alert. So in this case, I'm just running a little simulation of it, but you can think of this as, one of the predictive failure alerts that Steve mentioned. You could think of it as perhaps a fan failure, redundant fan failure. That would be another reason why I might want to look at a system and say, okay, this system hasn't failed completely, but perhaps it's lost some of its redundancy because one of the fans failed. Or perhaps I'm getting something like this, a predictive failure alert that tells me that the system, well, it's not as trustworthy as it was before. And so although these 4 workloads are currently still running on this system, I'm going to go ahead and take preventative action to move those workloads elsewhere in the cluster. And in fact, you saw they just kind of disappeared there. But if I change the window here a little bit, you'll see that what's really happening just below this is that it's doing a migration, and those workloads are moving elsewhere in my cluster. Now the system is actually in maintenance mode. So that's
Dave,
kind of a yeah, Steve.
Go ahead. No, I just want to make sure that we don't miss the reality here. You've done a great job, obviously, protecting the workload, which is is the ultimate. All right, that's what we want. But we still got a hardware problem. All right. So, I mean, is there anything else that we can do on that back side, on the physical side, to automate, making sure somebody knows about it and addresses it?
Right. That's a good point, Steve, because you're right. We've kind of taken care of the workload, but we still have we have a red light or yellow light blinking on the outside of the system, right? So someone's got to go take care of that. And so we want that automation now to then flip over to the notification process, right? And in fact, these things are going to happen really in parallel. At the same time as that error is getting delivered into the vCenter, we're also going to deliver that error to a couple other places as well. And so within our xClarity Administrator, and this is the main xClarity Administrator console, we can get into this and in a lot more detail on one of the other sessions, or if someone's got interest, just let us know. We'd be happy to go through, a full demonstration of xClarity Administrator. But you'll see on this console, some red lights and things that are highlighted here, yellows and reds that are already in the system. And it's always good to kind of get alerts to a management console like this, but we don't expect anybody to be sitting here staring at the xClarity console all day long. So part of what we want to do with this monitoring is do event forwarding. And so we can set up automated event forwarding, perhaps to another management tool in the infrastructure, because folks may not be looking at the xClarity console all day long, but maybe they're going to look at the Log Insight console. There's maybe another SNMP trap management tool that they need to get this event forwarded to. So from the hardware layer, we're going to forward it up to that additional management layer. Or maybe we need to actually get direct notification. So instead of just forwarding it to another management tool, some customers may want to notify their administrator or a partner who is providing, a managed infrastructure for a client. Might want to get one of their admin staff notified of one of these problems. So we can set up that standard event forwarder in here, and we can identify in this case as an example, where I want the email to be delivered. I can select which devices this is going to apply to. So I might not just want to spread the news to everybody. Maybe there's certain devices that have certain admin people that need to get notified, so I can select who gets the notification. And I can select the type of event also that gets forwarded in this way. So if I've got, blue informational alerts, I may not want to get that forwarded into my email and get it all clogged up in my phone. But if it's a red or yellow, then yeah, definitely I want to get identified that way, and I want to get that information forwarded to me. So it's really easy to set all that stuff up. And again, it's part of the automation process that's going to drive that uptime, because, okay, now we've got the workload rescued, so to speak, but someone's going to have to do something about it, right? And the next level that I think is important too is that we're not only just telling, the admin staff, because what would typically happen right now, I get that notification, and if I'm the administrator responsible for that system, now I've got to go, pick up a phone someplace, and I've got to place a service call. Well, in fact, what we're also automating is the placement of that service call as well. So, and right here within xClarity, if I go to the service and support pull down here, we'll see a whole bunch of things that we do to automate the interaction between Lenovo and our customers when these problems do occur. And so key to that here is our call home configuration, which you can see here I've identified the contact point for my infrastructure. And you can identify different contact points if you've got a broader infrastructure and you've got maybe a couple of data centers or several data centers and you'd have different contacts. You can actually identify all the way down to a different contact for every system if you needed to do that. Hopefully it's not that complex, but you've got the flexibility to do that. But anyway, what this person is identified now, that when we get that predictive failure alert, we're going to automatically send that back to Lenovo, open up the trouble ticket, and in fact, I could even go look at the service ticket status. So I've got all the service tickets. Again, hopefully you don't have as many as I've got kind of in this log here, but you can go and look at the open trouble tickets. It's already sent in all the diagnostics files, although if you needed to attach an additional file to it, it's easy enough to just select that service ticket if you wanted to maybe forward in an operating system log file or something you thought was important. It's real easy to take care of that. And so the whole idea here is that we're utilizing, the background management tools to not only rescue the workload with the integration into, in this case, I demonstrated vCenter, but we have the similar integration into other packages like Microsoft, for example, right? If you've got a Microsoft virtualized environment, we can do the same kind of thing there as well. But then also make sure that the right people know about it to then go ahead and, if it is a hardware problem, go ahead and get it addressed. And in fact, Steve, the other thing I think we wanted to talk a little bit about is, when that service person, then we've automatically dispatched that service person, but when they get to the system, I think we're doing some things to make it easier to service the box and get it back up and going as quickly as possible as well, right?
No, absolutely. In fact, it's it's one thing to know that, to get an alert from a system into a manager that says, hey, we've got a problem. But the key is, and that's also one of the things that was studied in that reliability study, is how do I find the right server? I mean, there's a bunch of them out there. And when I do, how long is it going to take me to run diagnostics and identify what the problem is and get it fixed? All right. So we have a tool. In fact, we've had it for decades, and people just want to make sure that we continue to use it, called LightPath Diagnostics. All right. And it is kind of what it sounds like. All right. I mean, to me, it reminds me of copiers, where if you got a paper jam, you pull the doors open and there's a little trail of lights in there that you follow to where the jam is, then you pull the messed up paper out. Well, in this case, we do use lights like that, but a little bit differently. And again, the ultimate goal here is minimizing the time to repair. All right. I mean, it's all hardware at some point. I mean, if you get enough of it, it's going to have some kind of a electronic or physical problem. The challenge is how big an impact is that going to make on my operation? And so we want to minimize the amount of time it takes to get this thing back up and running. So what you see here is an example of LightPath. And the first light we see is the one that's a bright yellow one here with the exclamation point. You see on the upper right-hand corner of this picture of this system. All right. So that's the first thing. So identify the system. There's actually one of those in the back. Your technicians are at the back. But next thing is, what's wrong with the system? Now, there's a variety of ways we implemented this. This one here happens to have a readout in the front. All right. Some of them you open it up and there's a list of the different subsystems are monitored. There's lights by the one that has the issue, but this one here is even more specific. Is the problem I've got? It's a multiprocessor system, obviously. Is on processor 1, DIMM number 9 has an issue. All right, so I mean, it's one thing to know that, but then if you got a system with 24 DIMMs or 48 DIMMs, or you can try to read the map on the box and figure out, well, which one is number 9. I mean, it gets to be a real challenge. We made it so easy you can't miss it. When you go in there, and this is just a snapshot of part of the memory DIMMs in there, but when you go in there, all of the components, and this is true of memory DIMMs, fans, power supplies, drives, everything, all the components that we are tracking PFA on and this reliability will have LEDs by them. And as you can see, there's an LED that is lighted here, all right, by the DIMM that is bad. The angle of my picture when I took a camera, it's a little off center, but it's actually that third one down. But again, think of this in a matter of literally seconds. I mean, you know which system, which subsystem, and what part has gone bad. Right, so I mean, we don't make it any easier, and it's foolproof. It's not like you do this the Russian roulette with the DIMMs, and you pull one out and you put a brand new one in and you fire it up, and oh, I didn't get that one, and work your way through it. So the idea here is minimizing that downtime. So this gives you a little bit of an idea, of what takes place at the actual system. All right, but I got to believe, Dave, besides this stuff here, that there are other things that we can do to automate, in the management process. Do you have some more you can share with us?
Yeah, Steve, there's one other area I really wanted to share as we talk about automation and avoiding problems, and that is management of firmware. And it's not the most exciting topic perhaps in all the world, but I think as we talk about how do I drive better availability into my infrastructure, it's one of the things that I like to preach a little bit about, is that staying on top of firmware updates is a really important part of that whole process. And I know in the x86 server industry, I talk to a lot of infrastructure managers that kind of have a different approach, quite honestly, where they have the if it's not broke, don't fix it approach. And I understand that, and I believe me, I live it. I really appreciate that perspective, because hey, everything is good. Why do I want to mess around with it? But the reality of the matter is that when we produce a firmware update, it's not just because our folks in our product engineering team didn't have anything to do this past weekend and they decided to write a new firmware. They were actually shooting a bug. As much as we like all of our firmware to come out 100% perfect, at the end of the day, it is software, and there's always things that we run into. Maybe there's a security patch that comes out from the processor, from a chipset. We need to produce a new firmware that's gonna get around a security problem that's been identified elsewhere in the industry. Those kinds of things come up. And so we really encourage customers to stay on some kind of a regular update schedule, whether that's once a year or twice a year. I certainly don't recommend checking every night for new updates and just throwing every new update that came out on your systems, but a periodic structured approach to say, okay, I want to do preventative maintenance on a regular basis is really key to driving overall availability of my infrastructure. Now, having said that, if the process of applying this new firmware and figuring out, what firmware do I need, how can I find it, and then getting it onto the systems, if that's so cumbersome that people don't want to do it, it takes too much time, or it introduces more downtime into the process because I've got to take systems offline in order to maintain them, that can be a problem. So we really focus on this with xClarity Administrator. And again, I just want to do a little bit of a demonstration here on some of our ability to provision these firmware updates. And it starts with the repository. So the repository within xClarity Administrator is an easy way to find the updates. And so one of two things might be happening. Number one, I might be having a problem, getting back to trying to get systems fixed quickly, right? I may be on the phone with the help desk and the help desk says, oh, hey, the problem you're having, that's fixed with the latest UEFI release or the latest xClarity controller firmware 3.4 or something like that. And so I've got to figure out, well, okay, where do I have that? And do I find a link someplace? Do I go to the website? Do I remember what my machine type model is, because the website's going to ask me for stuff like that? That's all too complicated, right? What I can really do is just come in here and say refresh catalog. and that's all I have to do. So the refresh catalog is going to reach out to our website. It's going to find the latest updates, and it's going to bring down information about those updates. And so if I expand out on one of these systems as an example here, and let me just let me pick on the Xclarity controller firmware here, and you'll see when I expand that out that it actually knows about this new 3.4 level that's out there. It just came out in January. It also shows me a bit of a history, which can sometimes be kind of convenient as well to understand what previous updates have been and what time frame they may have come out. And they may have, depending on my environment, I may have things at somewhat different levels. But the good thing is that now I can see what this 3.4 is. If I wanted to click on the release notes and find out more, I'm not, downloading, unpack, unzip. I don't have to go through all of these things to see what's really happening. I can see the change log to see exactly what was included in this particular release. And so if I'm responding to that kind of specific requirement to upgrade, one piece of firmware, I can find it quickly and I can get that done. And I'll kind of show the application process here in just a moment. On the other side, though, what I was kind of preaching about a little bit is this idea of preventative maintenance. So in that case, it's not just about applying, one firmware update. One of the challenges is, there's a bunch of different firmware that makes up these systems. There's the system board, the UEFI firmware, there's the Xclarity controller, the management firmware, there's Ethernet controllers, there's RAID controllers, right? How do I figure out, what goes well together? And that's one of the things that we've done to make that simpler. Also, we've begun publishing what we call best recipes or compliance policies. So the compliance policy is what I want to use if I'm going to do that preventative maintenance. And so here you can see I've got a number of different systems that I manage, but let me scroll down here a little bit because that VX, that Think Agile VX cluster that I was working on a little while ago there is a good example of where it's really important to have a best recipe that is tied to the infrastructure software that's running on that system. And that's one of the things, it's one of the advantages of our Think Agile VX offering is that we don't look at it as just any old server and, oh yeah, here's an update for that particular system. We make sure that before it makes it into this best recipe for March 2020 in this case, we've actually gone back and done the proper certification for this new firmware for the VX or the vSAN environment that I'm running. Because we know that it's a VX appliance, we know that it runs vSAN, and so we know we have to take that extra step to make sure that the things we're recommending inside of this best recipe are really properly certified and on VMware's compatibility list and all the rest of the stuff that goes along with that. So once again, we're making it easier. We're trying to automate some of that process because without that, right, then it's up to the administrator to go back and have to do research, right? And we all know that that's going to take more time and potentially is going to introduce opportunities for problems along the way. So we want to really simplify that whole approach by being able to provide these best recipes. So now I know what I need to do. Now I need to actually get it done. And you can apply the firmware here within Xclarity. In fact, I'll just show that real briefly here. If I go to Apply Activate, we'll see here's my list of all my systems. I can use this filter here over on the right-hand side, and I can find those VX appliances just by kind of typing the beginning of the name of the system there. And we can see that right now everybody looks kind of green. This guy's actually even a little bit further out of date, but all the rest of these folks look like they're green, but they're not using my latest best recipe. And so what I can do to come in here is I can select now from here to say, well, I really want to get to that Think Agile VX best recipe from March 2020. When I select that, it goes off and it does a health check and comes back and says, okay, well, based on that best recipe, here's all the things that I need to update. And you can see in some cases here, I'm pretty back level. I haven't listened to my own preaching, I guess, and I haven't gotten back and updated these systems in a while. So, there's a pretty significant update that needs to get done here. But the good news is it's telling me exactly what needs to be done. And I can, in fact, select that whole system and push the update from within Xclarity Administrator. But in this case, I'm not going to do that because in reality, this is not the most automated way to do it. I can do it from here, and I have the choice to either do the update immediately, which is fine if it's a brand new system, or if I have the luxury of a maintenance window, that's great. Because in some cases, the application of this firmware is going to require a reboot to activate. I could also do what we call a delayed activation, which basically says, okay, we're going to get everything prepared to go, but we're not going to reboot it right now. We'll wait for the next time the system reboots, and then we'll implement the updates at that point in time. But that's just kind of delaying it to some unknown point in the future. And if we're really driving for the kind of availability levels we want, well, we don't want that reboot to really happen anytime soon. So better than doing it here from Xclarity is integrating it in with the management at the virtualization layer. And so, again, in this case, I'm going to look at one of my individual systems here from my vCenter console, and I want to now look at how do I drive that update from within vCenter. And so part of this plugin that we have with Xclarity Administrator within vCenter, actually, I'll spend a second here to show you the other piece of it. Underneath the Monitor tab, we also provide additional information about those same events, right? So you saw the event earlier that drove that other system into maintenance mode, and so that would be reflected here in the event log. We also see greater hardware information. And so again, sort of part of the automation here is automating this information right into vCenter. So I don't have to stop and log into anything else. If I live most of my life, on the vCenter console managing my virtual infrastructure, bringing the hardware information right here where I look and not having to go to another console is really kind of a big advantage. But let me get back to the configure tab here and the point that I was on about the firmware updates. And I'm going to go down here again. You see the Xclarity functions that are added here. I'm going to click on firmware updates, and I'm going to create a new update right here within vCenter. And I'm going to choose to update with the policy, which means I'm going to utilize those best recipes that I've utilized or that I've pulled in utilizing Xclarity Administrator. So Xclarity Administrator goes out and accesses the catalog. It pulls down the best recipes. Now, I happen to pick the same one that I already reassigned here, but you can see I can select from any of those same best recipes. So I would use Xclarity Administrator to access the catalog, pull down the updates, pull down the best recipes. And when it comes time to apply the update, to apply that best recipe, I would come right here within vCenter to make that selection. It does the same kind of health check here. It tells me what's currently installed. It tells me where I want to go to this new level. But the key reason why I would do it from within here is this piece right here, right? This perform VM evacuation, because now it's going to automate the process that when I want to upgrade my firmware, it's going to put the system into maintenance mode. It'll move all the workload elsewhere in the cluster, right? So again, this is now updating my firmware with no downtime from an application point of view, right? So it moves the application safely to other nodes in the cluster, and then it goes through and does that update. And in fact, in this case, because it's a vSAN cluster, notice that's grayed out. I can't even uncheck that box because it's going to force me to choose how do I want to deal with the fact that, oh, this is a vSAN cluster. I have shared data. I have to make a choice about how I'm gonna deal with that, right, in that process. So I can now schedule this update to happen at 3 a.m. and at 3 a.m. it's going to automatically put the system into maintenance mode, and then it's going to do the firmware update. And when it's done, it's going to safely come back out of maintenance mode, right? And I will have automated that process. No differently than what an administrator would have to do, but they wouldn't have to sit there and wait for the maintenance mode to happen and wait for the firmware to be applied and wait for the reboot and all of those manual steps that they would have to have along the way. In fact, I can also do this at the cluster level. In this case, I selected on an individual server, but if I select it up at the cluster, I won't show it because it looks exactly the same, with the exception of the fact that now I could choose the firmware level for each node in the cluster, and then when I execute, it would actually automate it for the whole cluster. So it would go one system at a time, and it would put machine number 1 into maintenance mode, do the firmware update. When it's done, come back out, let the workload balance, go back to the second system, put it into maintenance mode, right? And that'd be a tremendous time saver to be able to update the whole cluster, again, with no application downtime, and with a lot of time saving along the way for that administrator, because it's taking care of kind of connecting the dots, if you will, and performing that firmware update. So that's I think a key thing, Steve. There's other things that certainly Xclarity is good at when it comes down to automating things, understanding inventory, We talked a little bit about the monitoring kinds of things. There's things we can do to automate the setup of a system as well. But in terms of really focusing in on driving better uptime, I think that's the firmware management is really a key one, and one that I wanted to kind of highlight in this discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. At this point, I'd say let's go ahead and kind of wrap up what we have talked about today. And doing so, I'd like to remind you of some of the things that we have talked about besides just the actual management pieces of this. One of those obviously was this chart Dave just brought up here on the fact that Lenovo is not just a hardware company. All right, I mean, we do have excellent infrastructure, but we put it together into appliances. Working with major leaders in the industry. We have what we call engineered solutions, and if you need to customize solutions, you can see the kinds of technology partners that we have at the top there. Besides that, then of course, we do have some new sessions coming up, and one of those in particular that I wanted to mention was the one that shows here on May 1, solutions supporting remote work environments, and that one again is this Friday, and it's really designed and so appropriate for our times today with this COVID virus thing. There's companies out there who have been doing VDI, working remote. First, those folks in their company where it makes sense. But then there's a lot of them, that obviously work in offices and other places. All of a sudden, they find themselves in a place where almost everybody has to work from home. So this is designed to help those companies, learn how to very quickly, efficiently, and reliably scale from a little bit to almost everything. And of course, then there are also organizations who never had any VDI in it. The model just didn't work for what they did, but now find themselves, in that same position where they really need it. All right, and so this is kind of an end-to-end, all the things that we can do to help companies, respond, to this kind of an environment. So there's also, of course, the things that we talked about as far as the briefing center, our capabilities, etc. Again, this is being recorded, so it will be available to you if you want to go back and revisit it, or if you want to share it with a colleague. If you want to reach out to and learn a little bit more about the briefing center, I mean, we do have a website out there. You'll see the link there at the top. And then lastly, if you want to get into more detail on this particular topic that we talked about today, or even some other topics, ones totally unrelated to this, and want the opportunity to work with the briefing center to see how we can help you, move forward on that and solve those issues, then certainly, send something to the email that's listed at the bottom here, and we'll be more than happy to work with you on that. Lastly, again, Dave, I'd like to thank you very much for covering this information. Greatly appreciated and very timely. And thanks again to all of you for spending this last just short of an hour with us going through this information. We hope you found it of value. All right, and we hope maybe we'll see you at one of these future sessions as well. So with that, again, I would just like to say, thank you, stay safe, right, and stay healthy.